Hello aspirants, welcome back to the session on disaster management. This is the second class. I have already uploaded the first class on the channel. Do go back and check the first class if you have not attended it. So this is the second class. In this class, we are going to read about the basic concepts that I had mentioned in the first class. We are just going to deal with them. In the next class, we are going to look at different types of disasters. But before that, you have to know what are the different basic terminologies, like what is a hazard, what is a disaster, what is a risk, what is vulnerability. Okay, so all this we'll be covering in this class. So let's dive in. Before we move on, you have to understand what disaster management is. Okay, very important. Before you read anything, you should know what you're reading. So what is disaster management? This can be understood by looking at this photo here. See, look at this photo here. On the top you see a disaster is happening. Okay, there is flood, there is landslide that is happening, and on the second photo you see disaster management. What is disaster management here? So disaster management can be defined as organization and management of resources. So when disaster happens, after disaster you need resources. You need resources. What kind of resources? Humanitarian resources like food, water, shelter. Okay, these are roti, kapda, makan. Fine. So all these you need. Then you also need resources in the form of personnels. When I talk about personnels, I'm telling you about the bureaucracy. I'm talking to you about the legislature. I'm talking to you about NDRF, army. Okay, all these are personnels that are resources for the government to manage disaster management here. Fine. So basically, what is disaster management? Disaster management can be defined as the organization and management of resources and responsibilities for what? For dealing with humanitarian aspects of emergency. So basically, where, what, and why. Okay, so what is disaster management? Disaster management is organization and management of resources and responsibilities. Why? Because to deal with the humanitarian aspect of emergency. A disaster is happening, a disaster has happened, it is under emergency, that region is under emergency. So why? Then where is why? It is in order to lessen the impact of disaster. Fine. Here you have to understand disaster management is not only post disaster. It is not just post disaster that we are talking. It is also pre disaster management. Fine. Please remember, very important point. Disaster management is just not about management of resources and responsibilities only after a disaster has happened. It is also preparing before the disaster will happen. Okay, so before we move on to the basic concept, you have to understand what is the importance of disaster management here. Other than one or two questions that you get in your mains, other than the marks you get in your mains paper, that is GS3. One more important thing that is important, one more important aspect that is important is that disaster management is important. Why? Because we are going through climate change, and due to climate change the disasters will be reckoning, the disasters will be regular. Okay, so as a bureaucrat, as a person who will be working in the government organization, as you will be under severe pressure to make decisions, as being a top tier bureaucrat, disaster management becomes very important for you all. Fine. And also disaster management, when you look at it, essay topics will also be covered here. So that is why disaster management is very important. Then before we look at what is disaster, you have to understand what is a hazard. You also have to understand what are vulnerability and risks. Okay, so firstly we'll be doing hazards, then we'll be doing vulnerability and risk, and later on at the last we'll be looking at the disasters here. Fine. So firstly we'll be doing hazards and risk. Okay, this you can easily understand by looking at this image here. So lightning is a hazard. Fine, lightning is a hazard. But what is the risk here? If you are standing when lightning strikes, and if you are standing under a tree, then there is a risk that you will be harmed. There is a risk that it may cause you physical injuries. Okay, so basically, what is a hazard? A hazard is a source of potential damage. Fine, hazard is a source of potential damage. Hazard, lightning is something which will cause damage. Okay, it has the potential to cause damage. Fine. In what way? Harm and adverse health effect on something or someone. Another example, if I have to take, consider a open window. Fine. There is a window that is open. This is a hazard. Okay. This is a hazard. But what is the risk? Risk will be if someone falls over. Okay. If imagine if a kid is playing around this open window, and if he or she trips and falls over, then it may cause a risk to their lives. Another example, if you want, I can take is that imagine if there are broken glass pieces that have fallen on the floor. This is a hazard. This has the potential to cause damage. But if someone, what is the risk associated? The risk will be that if someone steps on it, then they may get a cut. Okay. So that is the risk associated with the hazard. So please remember, hazard is the source of potential damage. Please remember this. Hazard is a source of potential damage. Then what about risk? Risk is a measure of expected loss. Fine. As I've told, if there are broken glass pieces and if you step on it, that is the risk. Okay. It is the expected loss due to a hazard event occurring in a given area over a specific period of time. So you can just remember this line here. Risk is a measure of expected losses due to hazard events occurring in a given area over a specific time period. Disaster risk arise when hazard interact with physical, social, economic and environmental vulnerabilities. This I'll explain later, but for now you understand what is a risk. Risk is a measure of expected loss due to hazard event occurring in a given area over a specific period of time. This I'll explain for you all later. Okay. Then I hope hazard and risk are clear for you all. Then moving on, we'll look at what are vulnerabilities. Okay, we'll look at what are vulnerabilities. Imagine that, okay, imagine the area of Western Ghats. Okay, imagine the area of Western Ghats here, and due to severe rain, monsoon rain, what are one of the effects that we see? We see the effect of landslides happening. Okay, landslide happening. See, landslide is in itself a hazard. What is the risk? Risk is human loss. Okay, there may be loss of lives here. Okay, that is the risk. But what is vulnerability? Due to a hazard, what are the effects that are caused? Okay, so basically when we look at vulnerabilities are the effects that are caused after a hazard has taken place. So there are different types of vulnerabilities here, like human and social vulnerabilities, fatalities, injuries, loss of income and employment, homelessness. Okay, then economic, very important, economic vulnerabilities, like imagine like for example, if you take the northern part of Karnataka was severely flooded few days back due to heavy rains. What had happened here? All the businesses were closed, all the shops were closed, all the schools were closed. Okay, due to the shutdown of business, it is causing a lot of economic loss here. Okay, it is causing a lot of economic loss. So these are the different types of vulnerability. So when we look at vulnerabilities, there are different types of vulnerabilities, that is physical, social, economic, environment and ecological. Okay, these are the different types of vulnerabilities that you see. Now we are done with your hazard. Now we are done with vulnerability and risk. Now we'll look into the main topic, that is disaster. So what is a disaster? Disaster is a serious disruption to the functioning of a community which cause human, material, economic and environmental losses beyond a community's ability to cope. Fine. So what is a disaster? Disaster is firstly it is disruption of functioning of life. Okay, functioning of life is disrupted here. Function of life is disrupted here, which cause human, material, economic and environmental loss. How does flood cause environmental loss here? Environmental loss is caused when, for example, if there is flood, again we'll take the example of flood only. If there are floods happening, then it causes soil erosion, loss of biodiversity. Fine. So these are the different types of vulnerabilities that happen when a disaster is caused. So basically what is a disaster? Disaster is combination of what? Hazard, vulnerability, insufficient capacity or measure to reduce the potential negative consequence of risk. Okay, so it is basically hazard plus vulnerability plus risk. Okay, all these equal to disaster here. Okay, I hope now it is clear what a disaster is. Disaster is a combination of hazard, vulnerability, and risk. Okay. Then, one more thing that you have to understand here is that every hazard is not a disaster. Fine. Every hazard is not a disaster. For example, as we have taken the example here. Okay. See, lightning will strike. Okay, the causes of lightning are natural. Okay, it is natural. But if it is happening in a vulnerable population, let's say 100 people are standing under a tree. Okay, if 100 people are standing here under a tree and no one is standing here, okay, and if a lightning strikes here, then it is not a disaster. But if lightning strikes under this tree, okay, then there may be loss of lives, then this will be considered as a disaster. Okay, so basically what we mean is that if there is a hazard happening, okay, and if that hazard is happening in a vulnerable population, then it will be a disaster. Okay, if hazardous geophysical event is happening in a vulnerable population area, then it will be considered as a disaster. If it is not happening in this vulnerable population, then that hazard is not considered as a disaster. Please remember this. This is the difference between a hazard and a disaster. Then there are different types of disasters that I'll be dealing with in the next class. So there are three different types of disasters. Firstly, we have natural disasters like floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, wildfires. Then we have man-made anthropogenic disasters like pollution, okay, pollution, terrorism, civil unrest, cyber attack. Okay, so these are the different types of man-made disasters. And another type of classification is your technological disaster, like industrial accidents, chemical spills, nuclear incidents. Okay, cyber warfare, cyber attacks. Okay, please tell me in the comment section whether war is a disaster. Please tell me whether war is a disaster or a hazard. Okay, please explain me that. So in the comment section, please explain whether war is a hazard or a disaster here. Okay, fine. So these are the topics I wanted to talk about.